The mountain wind howled through the pines as Olivia Thompson pressed herself against the rough bark of an ancient fir, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the swirling snow, she could see the dark shapes moving between the trees, their voices carrying on the bitter air like the growls of hunting wolves. Her hands trembled as she signed frantically to herself, a desperate prayer in the language of silence that had been her companion since birth. Behind her, the cabin glowed with warm lamplight, and she knew Anthony Collins was inside, probably wondering where she had gone. The mountain man who had taken her in 3 months ago, who had somehow learned to speak with his hands just so they could understand each other. The man who had become her anchor in a world that had always treated her silence as something broken, something to be pitied or ignored. But now the men who had driven her from the valley were here, led by that cruel-faced Douglas Ward, who had made it clear that a mute woman had no place in civilized society. They had tracked her to this remote sanctuary, and she could hear Ward's voice cutting through the wind like a blade. "We know she's here, Collins. The freak belongs in an institution, not running wild in these mountains. Hand her over, and we'll make this easy." Olivia's breath came in sharp puffs of white vapor as she watched Anthony step out onto the cabin's covered porch, his massive frame silhouetted against the golden light spilling from the doorway. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he held himself like a man preparing for violence. "She's under my protection," Anthony's voice carried clearly through the thin mountain air, steady and implacable as granite. "And she's not going anywhere she doesn't choose to go." Ward laughed, a harsh sound that made Olivia's skin crawl. Protection? From a mountain hermit who's probably half wild himself? The woman needs proper care, medical attention. She can't even speak, for God's sake. "She speaks just fine," Anthony replied, and Olivia saw him sign something toward the trees where she was hiding, a simple message that made her heart clench with fierce emotion. "I understand you." The memory of how they had met flooded through her mind as she crouched in the snow, remembering that day 3 months ago when her world had crumbled and she had fled into these mountains with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart full of desperation. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. It had been early autumn then, the aspen leaves just beginning to turn gold, when Olivia had finally reached her breaking point in the town of Millbrook Valley. She had been working as a seamstress in Virginia Perez's dress shop, grateful for the woman's kindness in giving her employment despite her disability. But kindness, she had learned, was a fragile thing in a world that saw difference as defect. The trouble had started when Douglas Ward, the town's self-appointed moral authority and largest landowner, had decided that Olivia's presence was somehow corrupting the community. He had begun a campaign of harassment disguised as concern for public welfare, claiming that a woman who could not speak was unfit for society, that her condition might be contagious, that she was a burden on decent folk. Virginia had tried to stand up for her, but Ward's influence ran deep. Soon customers stopped coming to the dress shop. Anonymous notes appeared, cruel words scrawled in harsh ink about freaks and God's judgment. Windows were broken in the night. The pressure mounted until even Virginia, tears streaming down her kind face, had been forced to let Olivia go. "I'm so sorry," Virginia had signed, one of the few people in town who had bothered to learn even basic signs. "I wish things were different. I wish people were better." But wishes, Olivia had learned long ago, were as insubstantial as morning mist. That night, she had packed her few belongings into a worn canvas bag and slipped out of town under cover of darkness, heading up into the mountains where she hoped to find some measure of peace, even if it meant facing the wilderness alone. She had been stumbling through the forest for 2 days, cold and hungry and beginning to despair, when she had literally collapsed at Anthony Collins's doorstep. Exhaustion had claimed her just as she glimpsed the rough-hewn cabin nestled in a clearing, and she had awakened hours later to find herself lying on a simple but clean bed, wrapped in warm blankets, with the scent of wood smoke and cooking food filling her nostrils. The man who had found her was unlike anyone she had ever encountered. Anthony Collins was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that touched his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was weathered by wind and sun, marked by years of solitude. But when he looked at her, there was no pity in his gaze, no uncomfortable shifting or awkward avoidance. He simply watched her with quiet attention, as if waiting for her to tell him what she needed. When she had tried to sign her thanks, expecting the usual blank incomprehension that greeted her attempts to communicate, he had surprised her by responding with careful, deliberate gestures of his own. "Are you hurt?" he had signed, his movements awkward but unmistakably clear. The shock of it had brought tears to her eyes. In all her 24 years, no one outside of Virginia and the elderly priest who had taught her to read had ever bothered to learn her language. Most people either spoke loudly at her as if volume could overcome her silence, or simply ignored her altogether, conducting conversations about her as if she were not present. "How?" she had signed back, her hands trembling with emotion. Anthony had smiled then, a rare expression that transformed his stern features. "Had a brother," he had signed slowly. "Born deaf, learned for him." The past tense told its own story, and Olivia had not pressed for details. She understood loss, understood the weight of absence that could settle on a person's shoulders like snow on mountain peaks. Instead, she had simply signed "thank you" and meant it with every fiber of her being. That had been the beginning of their strange partnership. Anthony had offered her shelter for as long as she needed it, and she had accepted gratefully, expecting to stay perhaps a week while she figured out where to go next. But days had turned to weeks, and weeks to months, and somehow she had found herself settling into a rhythm of life she had never imagined possible. Anthony's cabin was simple but well built, constructed of thick logs chinked with mud and moss to keep out the mountain cold. It consisted of 2 rooms, a main living area with a stone fireplace, rough-hewn table, and shelves lined with books, and a smaller sleeping chamber that he had given over to her while he made do with a bedroll near the fire. The furnishings were sparse but functional, everything crafted by his own hands with the care of a man who understood that in the wilderness, shoddy work could mean death. He made his living, and she learned, by trapping and hunting, trading furs and meat to merchants who came up the mountain paths in late spring and early fall. He also had a small garden where he grew potatoes, beans, and hardy vegetables that could survive the short mountain growing season. It was a life of careful self-sufficiency, and Olivia had thrown herself into learning its rhythms with the desperate gratitude of someone who had finally found a place where she belonged. She proved surprisingly adept at mountain life. Her small hands were perfect for the delicate work of preparing pelts, and her keen eyes could spot signs of animal movement that Anthony sometimes missed. She took over the cooking and mending, tasks that freed him to focus on hunting and the endless maintenance that mountain living required. More importantly, she brought something to the cabin that had been missing for the 5 years since Anthony had retreated to this remote sanctuary: companionship. Their conversations, conducted entirely in sign language, had a quality unlike anything Olivia had ever experienced. Without the constant background noise of voices, without the need to read lips or guess at meaning, communication became something pure and intentional. Every gesture mattered. Every expression carried weight. They talked about books, about the changing seasons, about the animals they observed, and the weather patterns Anthony had learned to read like scripture. Slowly, carefully, they had shared pieces of their histories. Olivia learned that Anthony had indeed had a younger brother, Kevin, born deaf into a world that had no patience for such differences. Their parents, simple farming folk, had done their best but lacked the knowledge to help Kevin navigate a hearing world. Anthony, 8 years older, had appointed himself his brother's protector and translator, learning sign language from a traveling preacher who had worked with deaf communities in the East. But protection, Anthony had discovered, was not always enough. When Kevin was 16, cruel boys from the neighboring town had cornered him near the river, taunting him for his silence, pushing him toward the swift running Atirtum. Kevin had slipped, struck his head on the rocks, and drowned while his tormentors fled. Anthony had found his body 3 days later, and the grief and rage had driven him from civilization into these mountains where he could escape the constant reminder of his failure. "I should have been there," he had signed one evening as they sat by the fire, his hands moving with the weight of old guilt. "You couldn't know," Olivia had replied. "Some cruelty comes without warning." She had shared her own story then, the loneliness of growing up different in a world that prized conformity above compassion. Her parents had died when she was young, leaving her in the care of an aunt who saw her deafness as a shameful burden. She had learned to read and write from Father Martinez, the old priest who had recognized her intelligence despite her silence. But formal education had been denied to her. Instead, she had been apprenticed to seamstresses and laundresses, expected to make her way through life as quietly and invisibly as possible. I used to dream, she had signed, of finding somewhere I could be myself without apology. Here, Anthony had replied simply, you can be yourself here. And for 3 months she had been. She had learned to read the mountain weather, to identify edible plants, to move through the forest with the quiet grace that survival demanded. She had helped Anthony improve his signing until their conversations flowed as naturally as water over stone. She had found peace in the rhythm of simple tasks and the profound silence of snow-covered peaks. But peace, she was learning, was as fragile as spring ice on a mountain stream. The men gathering outside Anthony's cabin were proof that the world's cruelty could reach even into these remote sanctuaries. Through the trees, she could see more figures emerging from the darkness. Ward had brought at least 6 men with him, alarmed, all convinced of their righteous mission to drag her back to what they called civilization. Among them, she recognized Eugene Chavez, the town sheriff, a weak man who bent to Ward's will like grass before wind. There was Jacob Perez, Virginia's own husband, his presence a betrayal that cut deep. Others she knew by sight, if not by name, men who had watched her struggle in their community and done nothing to help, but who now felt entitled to determine her fate. "This is your last chance, Collins," Ward called out, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Send her out peacefully or we'll come in and get her. Either way, she's coming back with us." Anthony's response was to step back inside the cabin, and Olivia heard the distinctive sound of a rifle being loaded. When he reappeared, he was carrying his hunting rifle with the casual competence of a man who knew how to use it. "I told you," Anthony said, his voice still calm but with an edge of steel underneath. "She's under my protection. That means anyone who wants to hurt her goes through me first." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, and Olivia knew she had to act. She could not let Anthony fight her battles for her, could not let him risk his life because of her problems. Moving as quietly as she could, she began to work her way through the trees toward the cabin, staying in the shadows but positioning herself where she could intervene if necessary. As she moved, her mind drifted back to the conversation that had changed everything between her and Anthony, the moment when their careful friendship had deepened into something more profound and dangerous. It had been just 2 weeks ago, during a fierce winter storm that had kept them confined to the cabin for 3 days. They had been sitting by the fire, sharing one of Anthony's books, when he had suddenly looked up at her with an expression she had never seen before. "Can I tell you something?" he had signed. She had nodded, setting aside the volume of poetry they had been reading together. "I was angry for so long," he had continued, his hands moving slowly, carefully, as if each word required consideration. "After Kevin died, I hated everyone. The boys who killed him, the town that let it happen, myself for not being there. I came up here to get away from all of it, to live alone because people seemed capable of nothing but cruelty." Olivia had waited, sensing that he was building towards something important. "But you," he had signed, and his eyes had met hers with startling intensity. "You've shown me that I was wrong. Not about the cruelty, that's real enough, but about being alone. I thought solitude was the only safety, but now I think maybe the real safety is in finding someone who understands." Her heart had hammered as she watched his hands form the words that would change everything between them. "I love you," he had signed simply. "Not because you need protection, not because I pity your silence. I love you because you see the world clearly, because you're strong enough to survive what would break most people. Because when you look at me, I don't see judgment or fear or expectation. I just see acceptance." The confession had hung in the air between them like morning mist, fragile and beautiful and terrifying in its implications. Olivia had felt her own walls crumbling, the careful barriers she had built around her heart dissolving under the warmth of his regard. "I love you too," she had signed back, the words feeling both foreign and inevitable on her hands. "I never thought anyone could see past the silence to find something worth loving." They had moved toward each other then, and their first kiss had been tender and desperate, and full of the wonder of two people who had given up on the possibility of being truly known by another soul. In the days that followed, their relationship had deepened with the intensity that comes when two damaged people find healing in each other's arms. But love, Olivia was learning, did not exist in a vacuum. The world had a way of intruding on even the most carefully guarded sanctuaries. And now that intrusion was taking the form of armed men who saw her silence as a disease to be cured and her independence as a problem to be solved. She reached the edge of the clearing just as Ward's patience finally snapped. "Enough of this," he snarled. "Eugene, Jacob, circle around back. Kevin, you and the others come with me. We're going in." The men began to move, spreading out to surround the cabin, and Olivia knew the moment for peaceful resolution had passed. Anthony saw it too, and she watched him sight down his rifle barrel, choosing his target with the cold calculation of a man who had learned to kill to survive. But Olivia had not fled into these mountains to cower while others fought her battles. She had come here to find her voice, even if that voice could only speak in gestures and actions rather than words. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the trees and into the clearing, her hands raised but her spine straight with defiant dignity. "Stop," she signed, knowing that most of the men could not understand her, but trusting that her meaning would be clear enough. The effect of her appearance was immediate and electric. Ward spun toward her, his face twisting with satisfaction at having his quarry in sight. Anthony's rifle swung in her direction, not to target her, but to cover her, his expression a mixture of pride and terror at her courage. "There she is," Ward said, his voice thick with triumph. "The freak shows herself at last." But Olivia was no longer the frightened, broken woman who had fled Millbrook Valley 3 months ago. The mountains had changed her, and Anthony's love had given her strength she had never known she possessed. She walked forward with measured steps, her chin raised, her hands moving in signs that cut through the cold air like blades. "I am not broken," she signed, her gestures sharp and precise. "I am not a freak. I am not your property to be claimed or your problem to be solved." Of course, none of them understood her words, but Anthony did. She saw him straighten, saw the fierce pride that blazed in his storm-gray eyes as he watched her claim her ground. "What's she doing with her hands?" Eugene asked nervously, his gun wavering as if her gestures might be some form of witchcraft. "Trying to cast a spell, probably," Ward sneered. "All the more reason to get her somewhere she can receive proper treatment." Anthony stepped down from the porch, his rifle still ready, but his attention focused on translating Olivia's words. "She says she's not broken," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "She says she's not your property, and she's right on both counts." "She's addled," Ward replied dismissively. "Living up here in the wilderness, probably eating roots and berries, sleeping rough. It's no wonder she's lost what little sense she had to begin with." Olivia's hands moved again, and this time her gestures carried the full force of her anger and determination. "Tell them," she signed to Anthony, "that I have found more sense in these mountains than I ever found in their town. Tell them that I have learned to hear the wind in the water, to read the sky in the seasons. Tell them that silence is not emptiness, it is fullness beyond their understanding." Anthony's translation rang out like a bell in the cold air, and Olivia saw several of the men shift uncomfortably. But Ward's face only hardened with increased determination. "Enough of this nonsense," he snapped. "The woman is clearly deranged. Eugene, arrest her for vagrancy and disturbing the peace. We'll sort out the rest once we get her back to town." Sheriff Chavez took a reluctant step forward, his hand resting uneasily on his pistol. "Now, miss, you just come along quiet-like and nobody needs to get hurt." But Olivia was done being quiet, done allowing others to make decisions about her life without her consent. Her hands flew in rapid, angry gestures, and Anthony's voice followed, translating her fury into words the men could understand. "She says she'd rather die free in these mountains than live as a prisoner in your town," Anthony announced. "And she says that any man who tries to take her against her will better be prepared to pay the price." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and suddenly the mood in the clearing shifted from tense to dangerous. Ward's face flushed with rage at being defied by a woman he considered less than human, and his hand moved to the pistol at his hip. "That's enough," he snarled. "If she wants to be treated like a wild animal, then we'll treat her like one. Take her down. The violence that followed erupted with the suddenness of a summer thunderstorm. Eugene drew his weapon, but Anthony's rifle cracked first, the bullet taking the sheriff in the shoulder and spinning him around like a child's top. Jacob Perez lunged forward, but Olivia was ready for him, her small fist connecting with his nose in a burst of blood and cartilage that sent him reeling backward. The other men scattered for cover, shouting and cursing, their carefully planned capture dissolving into chaos. Anthony worked the bolt of his rifle with practiced efficiency, sending another shot that splintered the tree bark inches from Ward's head and drove the man behind a fallen log. "You want her?" Anthony roared, his voice echoing off the surrounding peaks. "Then come and take her, but I promise you, some of you won't be going home." For a moment, the clearing fell silent, except for Eugene's groans and the harsh breathing of frightened men. Then Ward's voice rose from behind his makeshift barricade, thick with hatred and wounded pride. "You think you can hide up here forever, Collins? You think we'll just give up and go home? I'll bring the whole damn territory down on your heads if I have to. That woman belongs in an institution, and by God, that's where she's going to end up." Olivia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. She knew Ward well enough to recognize that his threat was not empty bluster. The man had connections, influence, the kind of power that could turn her sanctuary into a trap. If they stayed here, more men would come, better armed and more determined. Eventually, the mountains that had given her freedom would become her prison. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm her, she felt Anthony's presence beside her, solid and unwavering as the peaks themselves. His hand found hers, and their fingers intertwined with the natural ease of two people who had learned to communicate in ways that went deeper than words. "What do we do?" she signed with her free hand. Anthony's eyes swept the clearing, taking in the positions of their enemies, calculating odds and possibilities with the tactical mind of a man who had learned to survive in unforgiving places. "We run," he signed back, "deep into the mountains, where they can't follow. There are places I know, hidden valleys where we can wait out the winter. Come spring, we'll figure out what comes next." The plan was desperate, but it was their only option. Anthony knew these mountains like other men knew the rooms of their own homes, and if anyone could guide them to safety through the treacherous winter wilderness, it was him. But it would mean leaving behind everything they had built together, abandoning the cabin that had become their sanctuary, fleeing once again from a world that seemed determined to crush anything that did not fit its narrow definitions of normal. "Can we make it?" Olivia signed, her hands trembling with cold and fear. "Together," Anthony replied, and in that single word she heard all the love and determination that had sustained her through the darkest months of her life. "We can make it together." They began to move then, backing toward the cabin while keeping their eyes on the men scattered around the clearing. Ward and his followers seemed content to maintain their positions for the moment, perhaps hoping that time and cold would accomplish what direct assault had failed to achieve. But Olivia knew that patience would not last long, and when it broke, the violence would be swift and final. Inside the cabin, Anthony moved with the efficient haste of a man who had planned for exactly this contingency. He grabbed a large pack from beneath his bed and began stuffing it with supplies, dried meat, hardtack, ammunition, warm clothes, the basic tools of survival. Olivia helped, her hands shaking but her movements sure she gathered her own few possessions and the precious books that had become their evening companions. "How long?" she signed as they worked. "Until spring," Anthony replied grimly. "Maybe longer. Depends on how determined Ward is to hunt us down." The reality of what they were undertaking hit Olivia like a physical blow. Winter in the high mountains was a killing season, when temperatures dropped to levels that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes, and storms could bury entire valleys under 20 feet of snow. Even experienced mountaineers died in such conditions, and they would be traveling on foot, carrying everything they needed to survive on their backs. But the alternative was worse. She had seen the hatred in Ward's eyes, the absolute conviction that her very existence was an affront to his ordered world. He would not stop until she was locked away in some distant institution, drugged into compliance, or simply forgotten in a cell where her silence would no longer disturb his sense of propriety. "I'm not afraid," she signed, and was surprised to discover that it was true. Anthony paused in his packing to look at her, and she saw something in his expression that made her heart skip. It was not pity or protectiveness, but recognition. He saw in her the same fierce determination that had driven him into these mountains, the same refusal to surrender to a world that demanded conformity at the price of the soul. "I know," he signed back. "That's why we'll survive." They finished their preparations in grim silence, both understanding that they were closing the door on one chapter of their lives and opening another that might well be their last. But they were together, and that made even the prospect of death in the wilderness seem preferable to the living death that Ward and his kind offered. The sound of voices outside warned them that their time was running short. Ward was rallying his men, probably preparing for another assault on the cabin. They needed to move before the net closed completely around them. Anthony shouldered his pack and checked his rifle one final time. Olivia secured her own smaller bundle of possessions and moved to the window, peering out at the men who had come to destroy her newfound happiness. She could see Ward clearly now, his face twisted with frustrated rage as he gestured toward the cabin. "Ready?" Anthony signed. Olivia nodded, and together they moved toward the back of the cabin where a small door opened onto the forest. Anthony had built the cabin with multiple exits, a precaution born of years of solitary living in a place where danger could come from any direction. They slipped out into the night like ghosts, their feet finding the familiar path that led up toward the higher peaks. Behind them, the cabin glowed with warmth and light, a beacon of the life they were abandoning. Ahead lay only darkness and uncertainty, but they moved toward it without hesitation, their hands clasped together, their hearts beating in rhythm with their determined steps. The pursuit began almost immediately. Ward's men had been watching the front of the cabin so intently that it took them several precious minutes to realize their quarry had escaped out the back. But once they discovered the deception, their shouts of anger and frustration echoed through the forest like the howls of frustrated wolves. "There!" someone yelled. "Tracks in the snow! They went up the north ridge!" Anthony and Olivia moved through the forest with the desperate urgency of hunted animals, their breath coming in sharp puffs of white vapor as they climbed toward the higher elevations. The snow was deeper here, reaching past their knees in places, and each step required tremendous effort. But Anthony knew these trails even in darkness, and he led them unerringly upward, following paths that were invisible to anyone who had not spent years learning the mountain secrets. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder. Ward's men were crashing through the underbrush with the subtlety of a cattle stampede, their voices carrying clearly in the thin air as they coordinated their search. They had brought lanterns and torches, and the flickering lights bobbed through the trees like malevolent spirits. "Split up," Ward's voice commanded. "They can't have gotten far in this snow. Check every trail, every hiding place. I want them found before dawn." Anthony paused at a fork in the trail, his head cocked as he listened to the voices below. His knowledge of these mountains was their greatest advantage, but it would mean nothing if they were run to ground by sheer numbers. He needed to buy them time, to create confusion among their pursuers. "This way," he signed to Olivia, leading her down the left-hand path. But after 100 yards, he stopped and began breaking branches, scuffing the snow, creating obvious signs of their passage. Then he led her back to the fork and took the right-hand trail, this time moving with exaggerated care to leave as few traces as possible. It was an old hunter's trick, one that might buy them an hour or two as Ward's men followed the false trail into a box canyon that would force them to backtrack. Every minute of delay increased their chances of reaching the high country where pursuit would become exponentially more dangerous. They climbed steadily through the night, their legs burning with exhaustion, their lungs laboring in the thin air. The temperature continued to drop, and Olivia could feel the cold seeping through her clothes despite the exertion of the climb. Her fingers were growing numb, making it difficult to sign, and she could see ice crystals forming in Anthony's beard. But they pressed on, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant death, either from the cold or from the men who pursued them. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous, winding along narrow ledges where a single misstep would send them tumbling into the abyss. In daylight, it would have been challenging enough. In darkness, with snow making every surface slippery, It was an act of faith with each step. How much further? Olivia managed to sign during a brief rest, her hands shaking so badly that the gestures were barely recognizable. 2 hours to the pass, Anthony replied. Then down into the hidden valley. We can rest there. Build a fire. The promise of warmth and safety gave her strength to continue, and they resumed their desperate climb. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit had grown more distant, suggesting that Anthony's deception had worked, at least temporarily. But Olivia knew that Ward would not give up easily. He would regroup, bring in trackers, maybe even call for help from the territorial authorities. This was only the beginning of their flight, not the end. As they climbed higher, the forest began to thin, giving way to the stark landscape of the Alpine zone. Here, twisted pines clung to life in the cracks between rocks, their branches sculpted by constant wind into fantastic shapes. The snow was deeper but more wind-packed, making travel somewhat easier but exposing them to the full fury of the mountain weather. The wind picked up as they approached the pass, driving snow into their faces with stinging force. Olivia pulled her scarf tighter around her neck and pressed close to Anthony's broad back, using his body as a windbreak. She could feel him shivering despite his heavy coat, and she knew they were both approaching the limits of their endurance. But just as hypothermia began to fog her thinking, they crested the pass and began the descent into the hidden valley Anthony had promised. It was a narrow cleft between towering peaks, invisible from below and accessible only by the treacherous trail they had just climbed. Even in the darkness, Olivia could sense the shelter it provided, the way the wind died to a whisper and the snow fell straight down instead of driving horizontally. There, Anthony signed, pointing toward a dark shape nestled against the valley wall. Emergency shelter. Built it 3 years ago. The shelter was little more than a lean-to constructed of logs and stones, but it had a roof and walls that would keep out the worst of the weather. More importantly, it had a fire pit and a small supply of dry wood. Within minutes, Anthony had a fire crackling, and the blessed warmth began to drive the deadly cold from their bodies. They huddled together beside the flames, sharing their body heat and the meager food Anthony had managed to pack. The immediate crisis was over, but Olivia knew their ordeal was just beginning. They were trapped in this valley until the weather cleared, and even then, they would need to find a more permanent refuge before winter's full fury descended on the high country. What now, she sighed in, when feeling had returned to her fingers. Anthony stared into the fire, his face grave with the weight of their situation. We wait, he replied. Let Ward and his men exhaust themselves searching the lower trails. When the storm passes, we'll move deeper into the mountains, find a place where we can hole up until spring. And then we decide whether to keep running or make a stand. The storm that had been threatening all evening finally arrived with the dawn, bringing with it winds that howled like banshees and snow that fell so thickly it was impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Under other circumstances, such weather would have been a deadly threat, but now it was their salvation. No one, not even the most determined pursuer, would venture into the high country during a blizzard of this magnitude. They spent the day huddled in their makeshift shelter, feeding the fire and sharing stories to keep their spirits up. Anthony told her about his childhood on his family's farm, about the brother he had loved and failed to save. Olivia shared memories of her parents, dead now for 15 years but still vivid in her heart, and of the small kindnesses that had sustained her through years of loneliness and rejection. Do you ever wonder, she sighed as the storm raged outside, what we did to deserve this? Why the world seems determined to punish us for being different? Anthony was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they might hold answers to questions that had tormented him for years. I used to, he finally replied. After Kevin died, I spent months asking God why he had made my brother deaf if he was just going to let him be killed for it. Why create something beautiful and then allow the world to destroy it? And what answer did you find? That maybe the question is wrong, Anthony signed slowly. Maybe it's not about what we did to deserve cruelty. Maybe it's about what the world loses when it chooses cruelty over compassion. Olivia considered this, watching the play of firelight across his weathered features. You think we're meant to be teachers? I think we're meant to be ourselves, he replied. And if that teaches others something about the value of difference, about the strength that comes from surviving what would break weaker people, then maybe that's enough. The philosophical discussion was interrupted by a sound that made them both freeze. Voices, distant but unmistakable, cutting through the howl of the wind. Someone was out there in the storm, and given their circumstances, it could only be their pursuers. Anthony moved to the shelter's opening and peered out into the swirling snow. After a moment, he pulled back, his face grim. 3 men, he signed. Maybe 4. They're following our trail, but the storm is making it hard for them to stay on track. Olivia felt her heart sink. She had hoped the blizzard would force Ward's men to give up, at least temporarily, but it seemed their determination to capture her was stronger than their sense of self-preservation. "What do we do?" she asked. Anthony was already moving, gathering their supplies and kicking snow over the fire. "We run again," he replied. "There's another trail, leads higher into the peaks. They won't expect us to go up in this weather." The idea of venturing back out into the storm filled Olivia with dread, but she could see the logic in Anthony's plan. Their pursuers would expect them to seek shelter, to wait out the worst of the weather. By doing the opposite, by pushing higher into the mountains where only the desperate or the foolish would venture, they might throw off the pursuit entirely. They shouldered their packs and stepped back out into the howling maelstrom. The cold hit them like a physical blow, and within seconds, Olivia could feel ice forming on her eyelashes. The wind was so strong it threatened to knock them off their feet, and the snow was falling so heavily that Anthony, walking just 3 feet ahead of her, was barely visible. But somehow, through instinct or experience or sheer stubborn determination, Anthony found the trail he was looking for. It was little more than a game path, winding up through a landscape of rock and ice toward peaks that disappeared into the storm clouds. Under normal circumstances, attempting such a climb would have been suicidal. In current conditions, it was merely desperate. They climbed for what felt like hours, their world reduced to the next step, the next handhold, the next gasping breath. The cold was beyond anything Olivia had ever experienced, a living thing that seemed determined to steal the life from her body 1 degree at a time. Her feet were numb, her hands clumsy with hypothermia, and she could feel her thinking becoming sluggish and confused. But Anthony pressed on, and she followed, driven by love and trust and the simple refusal to give up. When she stumbled, he was there to catch her. When the trail disappeared under drifting snow, he found it again through some mysterious communion with the mountain itself. He was her anchor in the storm, her guide through a landscape that seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to challenge it. Just when she thought she could not take another step, the trail leveled out and Anthony led her into the shelter of an overhanging rock formation. It was not much protection from the storm, but it broke the worst of the wind and gave them a chance to rest and assess their situation. "Can you go on?" Anthony signed, his movements stiff with cold. Olivia looked back the way they had come, seeing nothing but swirling snow and darkness. Somewhere behind them, men were following their trail, driven by hatred and the conviction that they were doing God's work. Ahead lay only more cold, more climbing, more uncertainty. But between those two choices, there was really no choice at all. "Yes," she signed back. "I can go on." They resumed their climb as the storm began to show signs of abating. The wind died down to a more manageable howl, and the snow thinned enough to allow them glimpses of their surroundings. They were higher now than Olivia had ever been, in a realm of ice and stone where nothing grew, and the air was so thin that every breath was a conscious effort. But the improved visibility came with its own dangers. If they could see further, so could anyone following them. And sure enough, as they paused on a narrow ledge to catch their breath, Olivia spotted movement far below. Dark figures struggling up the trail they had just climbed, moving with the dogged persistence of men who would not be denied. "Still coming," she signed to Anthony. He looked back, his face set in grim lines. "Ward," he replied. Should have known he wouldn't give up. The pursuit had become personal now, Olivia realized. It was no longer just about returning a disturbed woman to proper care. Ward's pride had been wounded, his authority challenged, and he would not rest until he had proven that his will could not be defied. The storm that should have driven him back to safety had only intensified his determination. How many? Anthony asked. Olivia counted the distant figures. 3, maybe 4. Hard to tell in this light. It was fewer than the original group, which meant that some of Ward's men had either given up or been defeated by the mountain conditions. But those who remained were clearly the most determined, the most dangerous. They had followed her and Anthony into conditions that would have killed lesser men, and they were still coming. Anthony studied the terrain ahead, his experienced eye reading possibilities that were invisible to Olivia. There, he signed, pointing toward a narrow pass between 2 towering peaks. If we can reach that saddle, we can get down into the next valley. From there, we can circle back toward the lower elevations, maybe find a place to hole up until spring. The plan sounded reasonable, but Olivia could see the doubt in Anthony's eyes. The pass he indicated was at least 2 hours away, assuming they could maintain their current pace, and their pursuers were gaining ground, moving faster than seemed possible in such treacherous conditions. "They're going to catch us," she signed, the words heavy with resignation. Anthony's jaw tightened with determination. "Not if I can help it." He began moving again, but this time his pace was different. Instead of the steady, sustainable rhythm they had maintained during their climb, he was pushing harder, sacrificing long-term endurance for short-term speed. Olivia understood the logic. They needed to reach the pass before their pursuers could close the gap, even if it meant exhausting themselves in the process. They climbed with desperate urgency, their lungs burning in the thin air, their muscles screaming with fatigue. The trail grew steeper and more exposed, winding along precipices where a single misstep would mean a fall of hundreds of feet. In several places, they had to use their hands as much as their feet, clinging to icy rock faces while the wind tried to tear them loose. But gradually, impossibly, they began to pull away from their pursuers. Anthony's knowledge of the mountains was telling now, allowing him to choose the most efficient routes while Ward's men struggled with unfamiliar terrain. The gap between hunter and hunted began to widen, measured in precious minutes that might mean the difference between freedom and capture. They were within sight of the pass when disaster struck. Olivia was following Anthony across a particularly treacherous section of trail when the rock beneath her feet gave way. She felt herself falling, her hands scrabbling desperately for purchase on the icy stone, and for a terrifying moment she was certain she was going to plummet into the abyss. But Anthony's reflexes were lightning quick. He spun around and lunged forward, his strong hand closing around her wrist just as she lost her grip entirely. For a moment they hung there, balanced on the knife edge between life and death, with only Anthony's strength and determination standing between Olivia and the void. "Hold on," he grunted, his voice strained with effort as he began to pull her up. Olivia tried to help, scrabbling with her feet against the rock face, but the stone was too smooth and icy to provide purchase. She was dead weight, and she could see the strain in Anthony's face as he fought to haul her to safety. His grip was strong, but she could feel his fingers beginning to slip on her ice-covered sleeve. "Let me go," she signed with her free hand, the gesture barely visible in the dim light. "Save yourself." "Never, Rashim," Anthony replied through gritted teeth, and with a tremendous effort, he managed to swing her toward a narrow ledge where she could get her feet under her. Together they scrambled up onto more solid ground, both of them shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. But there was no time to rest, no time to process how close they had come to disaster. Behind them, their pursuers were still climbing, still closing the distance with relentless determination. They reached the pass just as the sun broke through the storm clouds, painting the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Under other circumstances, it would have been a moment of breathtaking beauty. But now the improved visibility only highlighted their vulnerability, making them visible to anyone looking up from the trails below. "There they are." The shout echoed off the surrounding peaks, and Olivia turned to see Ward himself, still several hundred feet below but climbing steadily. His face was a mask of rage and determination, and she could see the pistol in his hand gleaming in the morning light. The descent into the next valley was even more treacherous than the climb had been. The trail switched back down a steep slope covered in loose scree that shifted and slid with every step. One moment they were picking their way carefully across stable ground, and the next they were surfing down a river of loose stone that threatened to carry them over the edge of a cliff. Anthony led the way, his mountain-bred instincts guiding them through the maze of hazards. but Olivia could see the exhaustion in his movements, the way his shoulders sagged with weariness. They had been climbing for nearly 12 hours straight, pushing their bodies far beyond normal limits, and even his remarkable endurance had boundaries. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit continued. Ward and his remaining men had reached the pass and were beginning their own descent, moving with the reckless haste of men who sensed their quarry was finally within reach. Occasionally, a shout would echo across the valley, or the crack of a rifle shot would ring out as one of their pursuers tried a long-range shot at the fleeing couple. "Can't keep this up much longer," Anthony sighed during a brief rest behind a boulder. Olivia could see the truth of his words in his face. His lips were blue with cold, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. He had given everything he had to get them this far, but human endurance had limits, and they were approaching his. "Then we make a stand," she signed back, surprised by her own calm. "Here, where we choose the ground." Anthony looked around, his tactical mind assessing their position. They were about halfway down the valley wall, on a narrow shelf of rock that commanded a good view of the approaches from above. There was cover from the boulders scattered across the ledge, and the position would be difficult to assault directly. "It's defensible," he admitted, "but we're outnumbered, and they have more ammunition." "Then we make every shot count," Olivia replied. She had never fired a gun in her life, had never even held one until Anthony had begun teaching her basic marksmanship during their months together in the cabin. But she understood the principles well enough, and desperation could be a powerful teacher. Anthony nodded slowly, recognizing that they had reached the end of their flight. "All right," he signed, "we make our stand here." They quickly arranged their position, using the natural cover of the rocks to create firing positions that would allow them to command the approaches. Anthony checked his rifle and counted his remaining ammunition. 12 rounds, plus the 6 in his pistol. Not much for what was likely to be their final battle. "When they come," he signed to Olivia, "stay low and don't expose yourself unnecessarily. Let me do the shooting until you're sure of your target." She nodded, understanding that her role would be more about moral support than tactical contribution. But she was determined to do whatever she could to help, even if it meant picking up Anthony's rifle if he fell. They didn't have long to wait. Ward and his men appeared on the trail above them within minutes, moving cautiously now that they realized their quarry had stopped running. Olivia could see Ward clearly, his face twisted with rage and exhaustion, his expensive city clothes torn and stained from the brutal climb. "Collins!" Ward's voice echoed across the valley. "This is your last chance. Send the woman down and we'll let you live." Anthony's response was to work the bolt of his rifle, the metallic sound carrying clearly in the thin air. "Come and take her," he shouted back. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Ward's men had spread out along the trail above, looking for angles of attack. But the position Anthony had chosen was strong. Any assault would have to come across open ground where his rifle could exact a heavy toll. But Ward was not a man to be denied, and Olivia could see him organizing his followers for what would likely be a coordinated rush. They had come too far and sacrificed too much to give up now, and she realized that this confrontation would end only when one side or the other was destroyed. "I'm sorry," she signed to Anthony as they waited for the attack to begin. "For what?" he replied. "For bringing this down on you. For destroying your peace." Anthony turned to look at her, and she was startled by the intensity of emotion in his eyes. "You didn't destroy anything," he signed. "You gave me something to live for besides just surviving. Whatever happens here, I want you to know that these past months with you have been the happiest of my life." Before she could respond, the attack began. Ward's men came down the slope in a rush, shouting and firing as they ran. Anthony's rifle cracked in response, and one of the attackers spun around and fell, clutching his leg. But the others kept coming, using covering fire to advance from boulder to boulder. The battle was brief but intense. Anthony worked his rifle with mechanical precision, making every shot count, but there were simply too many targets. A bullet spanged off the rock near Olivia's head, sending stone chips flying, and she realized that their position was not as impregnable as she had hoped. "They're flanking us," Anthony signed, pointing toward movement on their left flank. "We need to move." But as they prepared to abandon their position, a new sound echoed across the valley, the crack of rifle fire from an unexpected direction. Someone else was shooting, and from the confused shouts above them, it was clear that Ward's men were taking fire from behind. Through the swirling gun smoke, Olivia saw figures moving along the ridge above Ward's position. At first, she thought it might be more of Ward's men arriving as reinforcements. But as the shooting intensified, it became clear that the newcomers were firing at Ward's group, not supporting them. "Who are they?" she signed to Anthony. He peered through the scope of his rifle, trying to identify the unexpected arrivals. After a moment, his face broke into a grin of fierce satisfaction. "Mountain men," he signed back. "Friends of mine. Must have heard the shooting and come to investigate." The arrival of reinforcements changed the entire dynamic of the battle. Ward's men found themselves caught between two fires, unable to advance on Anthony's position without exposing themselves to the rifles above. Several of them were already down, and the others were clearly losing their appetite for the fight. "Fall back," Ward shouted, his voice cracking with frustration and fear. "Regroup at the pass." But retreat was easier ordered than accomplished. The mountain men above had positioned themselves to command the escape routes, and Ward's surviving followers found themselves trapped in a deadly crossfire. One by one, they threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, preferring captivity to death. Only Ward himself refused to give up. Olivia watched in horrified fascination as the man who had pursued her across hundreds of miles of wilderness made a desperate last stand, firing wildly at targets he could barely see while bullets chewed the ground around his feet. "Surrender, Ward," Anthony called out. "It's over." But Ward was beyond reason, consumed by a rage that had nothing to do with justice or public welfare, and everything to do with wounded pride and thwarted will. He turned his pistol toward Olivia, his face twisted with hatred, and she realized that if he could not have her as his prisoner, he would settle for having her as his victim. The shot that ended Douglas Ward's life came from Anthony's rifle, fired with the cold precision of a man who had learned that sometimes violence was the only answer to violence. Ward crumpled to the ground like a marionette with severed strings, his crusade of hatred finally brought to its inevitable conclusion. In the silence that followed, Olivia felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Ward had been a cruel man, driven by prejudices that had no place in a civilized world. But he had also been a human being, and his death was a reminder of how far they had all fallen from the ideals of compassion and understanding that should have guided their actions. The mountain men who had saved them proved to be a rough but kindly group of trappers and hunters who had known Anthony for years. They had been working their trap lines when they heard the gunfire and had come to investigate, arriving just in time to turn the tide of battle. "Heard you'd taken up with a woman," said their leader, a grizzled veteran named Kevin Mitchell. "Didn't expect to find you fighting a war over her." "She's worth fighting for," Anthony replied simply, and Olivia felt her heart swell with pride and love. The surviving members of Ward's posse were disarmed and sent back down the mountain with a warning never to return. Most of them seemed relieved to escape with their lives, and Olivia doubted they would have any appetite for further pursuit. Without Ward's driving hatred to motivate them, they were just ordinary men who wanted nothing more than to return to their homes and families. But the victory came at a cost. Anthony had been wounded in the fighting, a bullet grazed along his ribs that was not serious but would need attention. More importantly, their sanctuary in the high mountains had been compromised. Too many people now knew where to find them, and there would inevitably be questions about Ward's death that could bring unwanted attention from territorial authorities. "What now?" Olivia signed as they prepared to leave the battlefield behind. Anthony looked out across the vast expanse of peaks and valleys that stretched to the horizon, his face thoughtful. "There are other places," he replied, "deeper in the wilderness, where no one will think to look. We can build a new life there, if you're willing." Olivia considered the offer, weighing the promise of safety against the certainty of hardship. Life in the deep wilderness would be challenging in ways she could barely imagine, but it would also be free, a chance to live on their own terms without the constant threat of interference from a world that could not accept their differences. "Together," she signed. "Always together," Anthony replied, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted of snow and gunpowder and hope. 6 months later, Olivia stood on the porch of their new cabin, watching the sunrise paint the surrounding peaks in shades of gold and crimson. The cabin was smaller than their first home, built in a hidden valley so remote that even the mountain men rarely ventured there. But it was theirs, built by their own hands in a place where they could live without fear of discovery or persecution. The winter had been hard, harder than anything she had experienced in her previous life. There had been days when the temperature dropped so low that stepping outside meant risking frostbite. Weeks when they had been snowed in with nothing but each other for company. But they had survived, and more than that, they had thrived. Anthony emerged from the cabin behind her, carrying 2 cups of coffee and moving with the easy grace of a man who had found his place in the world. The wound he had received in their final battle with Ward had healed cleanly, leaving only a thin scar as a reminder of their ordeal. "Beautiful morning," he signed, handing her one of the cups. Olivia nodded, breathing in the crisp mountain air and feeling a contentment she had never known was possible. "Do you ever miss it?" she signed back. "The old life, the cabin, the easier times?" Anthony considered the question, his eyes scanning the wilderness that had become their domain. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I remember what we have here, what we've built together, and I know we made the right choice." They had indeed built something remarkable in this remote valley. The cabin was snug and well-constructed, designed to withstand the worst that mountain weather could throw at it. They had a garden that provided fresh vegetables during the short growing season, and Anthony's hunting and trapping skills ensured they never lacked for meat. More importantly, they had found a peace that went deeper than mere physical comfort. In the months since their escape, Olivia had discovered strengths she never knew she possessed. She had learned to read the mountain weather like a book, to identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, to move through the forest with the silent grace of a born hunter. The woman who had once cowered before the cruel words of ignorant townspeople had been transformed into someone who could face down a charging bear or navigate a blizzard with equal confidence. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation had been in their relationship. The desperate love born of shared danger had deepened into something more profound and lasting. They had learned to communicate not just in sign language, but in the subtle vocabulary of shared glances, gentle touches, and comfortable silences. They were partners in the truest sense, each complementing the other's strengths and compensating for their weaknesses. "Spring's coming early this year," Anthony observed, pointing toward the valley below where patches of green were beginning to show through the snow. Olivia followed his gaze and felt a familiar stirring of anticipation. Spring in the mountains was a time of renewal, of new beginnings and fresh possibilities. This year, it would bring something even more special, their first child, conceived during the long winter nights when they had found comfort and joy in each other's arms. She placed her hand on her still flat stomach, marveling at the miracle growing within her. The child would be born into a world of silence, at least from her perspective, but it would also be born into a world of love and acceptance that she had never known in her own childhood. "What if the baby is deaf?" she had signed to Anthony when they first realized she was pregnant. "Then we'll teach them to speak with their hands," he had replied without hesitation. "And they'll grow up knowing that different doesn't mean broken." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted her reverie, and both she and Anthony turned toward the narrow trail that led down from their valley. Visitors were rare in this remote location, and unexpected ones were cause for concern. But as the rider came into view, Olivia recognized the familiar figure of Kevin Mitchell, the mountain man who had helped save them during their final confrontation with Ward. He was leading a pack horse and wore the satisfied expression of a man bringing good news. "Morning, folks," Kevin called out as he approached the cabin. "Mind if I light and set a spell?" "Always welcome," Anthony replied, moving forward to help with the horses. "What brings you so far from the main trails?" Kevin dismounted with the careful movements of a man who had spent too many years in the saddle. "Got some news I thought you'd want to hear," he said, accepting the cup of coffee that Olivia offered. "About that business last winter." Olivia felt a chill of apprehension. She had hoped that Ward's death would be the end of their troubles, but she knew that powerful men often had powerful friends who might seek vengeance. "What kind of news?" Anthony asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the rifle that was never far from reach. "Good news mostly," Kevin assured them. "Turns out Ward had more enemies than friends back in Millbrook Valley. When word got out about what really happened, about how he'd been persecuting you and yours, public opinion turned against him pretty quick. The territorial governor launched an investigation, and what they found wasn't pretty. Kevin paused to take a sip of his coffee, clearly enjoying the drama of his revelation. Seems Ward had been using his position to intimidate and exploit folks for years, forcing people off their land, taking bribes, all manner of corruption. The woman who ran the dress shop, Virginia something, she came forward with a whole list of Ward's victims. Said you were just the last in a long line of people he'd driven out of town. Olivia felt tears prick her eyes at the mention of Virginia Perez, the kind woman who had tried to help her when everyone else had turned away. It meant more than she could express to know that Virginia had found the courage to speak out against Ward's cruelty. "What's the upshot?" Anthony asked. "Well, officially, Ward died in an unfortunate accident while pursuing fugitives in the mountains," Kevin said with a wry grin. "The territorial authorities have made it clear that they consider the matter closed. No charges, no investigation, no bounty on your heads. You're free to come and go as you please." The news was almost too good to believe. For months, Olivia had lived with the fear that they would always be fugitives, always looking over their shoulders for the next group of pursuers. To learn that they were truly free, that they could choose their own path without fear of legal consequences, was a gift beyond measure. "There's more," Kevin continued. "That Virginia woman, she's been asking around about you. Seems she'd like to get word to you that you're welcome back in town anytime. Said she's got a business proposition that might interest you." Olivia exchanged glances with Anthony, seeing her own mixture of curiosity and wariness reflected in his eyes. The idea of returning to civilization held a certain appeal, but they had built something precious in this remote valley, something that might not survive the transition back to the world of towns and people. "We'll think about it," Anthony said diplomatically. Kevin nodded, understanding that such decisions could not be made lightly. "No rush," he said. "I'll be heading back through Millbrook in a month or so. If you decide you want to send word, I can carry a message." After Kevin departed, Olivia and Anthony spent the rest of the day discussing their options. The freedom to choose was both exhilarating and terrifying. They could stay in their mountain sanctuary, raising their child in the pure air and endless silence of the high country, or they could return to the world below using their hard-won wisdom to help others who faced the kind of persecution they had endured. "What does your heart tell you?" Anthony sighed as they sat by the fire that evening. Olivia considered the question, weighing the competing desires for safety and purpose that warred within her. "That maybe we've learned something worth sharing," she replied finally. "That maybe our story could help other people who think they're broken or worthless because they're different." Anthony nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing. We could start small, maybe just visit town occasionally. See how people react, whether the changes Kevin described are real." The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. They would not abandon their mountain home, but neither would they hide from the world indefinitely. They had something valuable to offer. Proof that love could bridge any gap, that communication went deeper than words, that strength could be found in the most unlikely places. As Olivia drifted off to sleep that night, her hand resting on her growing belly, she thought about the child who would soon join their family. That child would grow up knowing that silence was not a limitation, but a different way of experiencing the world. They would learn that love spoke in gestures and touches as much as in words, that true communication came from the heart rather than the voice. And perhaps, if they were very lucky, that child would help build a world where difference was celebrated rather than feared, where the language of the hands was as valued as the language of the voice, where every person could find their own way to speak their truth. The mountain wind whispered through the pines outside their cabin, carrying with it the promise of spring and new beginnings. In the distance, wolves howled their ancient songs to the star-filled sky, and Olivia smiled as she listened to their wild music. She had found her voice at last, not in sound but in the deeper language of love and acceptance and hope. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that the human spirit could triumph over any obstacle. But tonight she was content to rest in the arms of the man who had learned to speak her language, in the home they had built with their own hands, in the silence that had become her greatest strength. The story that had begun with flight and in fear had become one of love and courage, and the unshakable conviction that every person, no matter how different, had something precious to contribute to the world. And in the end, perhaps that was the most important message of all.